Welcome to the Accidental Experts podcast. I'm your host, Bryce Hamilton. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a child and family therapist. I have been in practice for over 15 years, and I'm also a mom of 4. So I know the challenges both professionally and personally. I'm so glad that you're here today to grow your parenting toolbox. Please come as you are and be ready to learn. My goal is to make you the accidental expert so that you can raise healthy humans. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We're so glad you're with us today. We have a special guest. Her name is Beth Tyson, and she is going to be talking to us about childhood trauma. And I think this is such an important topic because trauma can look so different to different individuals. And sometimes we don't realize that the experiences that our family has been through or our children have been through might be trauma. So Beth is an author, she's a public speaker, and she's a psychotherapist, and she is on a mission to help people to become more trauma informed. With that, let's get to Beth.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's an honor.
Yes, absolutely. So we're going to be talking about childhood trauma, and I think this is such an important topic. And it's complex because it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So can we start by just kind of defining what trauma is? Like, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, sure. I don't have the textbook definition in front of me, but I'll give you my interpretation of it. So trauma is any overwhelming experience and the response that we have to that experience. And it can be something that happens in, a one-time event, like a car accident or a fire or something, or it can be a repetitive type of trauma that happens over time. So there's acute trauma, and then there's complex trauma that happens typically in relationships or typically in situations where abuse is taking place of some kind. And so it's like a long-term trauma that plays out over time. And so the important thing to know about the definition of trauma is that it is the response that the individual has to the event. So it's not so much about the event as it is the response that we're having in our bodies and in our nervous systems. So that is why trauma is more subjective, because trauma is different for everyone. Two people can experience the same exact thing, and one person might have trauma responses from it and another person might not. And that depends on their genetic makeup, their support systems around them, any previous history of trauma, so many different things, the environment they grew up in, the relationships that they had as children, like there's so many variables. And so it's important to know for your listeners that what somebody feels is traumatic is up to them. It's not anything we can judge or say, oh no, that wasn't traumatic. It really is up to the individual to determine, like, no, this overwhelmed me. This overwhelmed my life and my world. And I've been having trouble coping with everyday tasks because of this thing that happened. And so that's my way of explaining what trauma.
Yeah, no, it's perfect, because I do think, like, in my practice, I'm often saying something very similar, but just like trauma is so personal, right? That it is our own experience of that. So that's the perfect definition. And I think that's what makes trauma hard, is like, we could have gone through something with our children, right? Like maybe a divorce, for instance, right? And we might have thought as the grown-up, like, hey, we handled that really well. This was great. Like, we were really mature about this. Like we put our adult pants on, right? Like we just really handled this maturely. And our kid might feel totally different. Or we might have thought, wow, that was really traumatic. That was so hard. And our kid is like, seems, that they're doing okay with that. And so I think that does make it hard, because we also have our opinion. And so then sometimes I think we may not provide as much space for our kids because we interpret it differently. Like, oh, that was totally fine. Like, yeah, you missed the bus and that was like totally fine. But that might have been a trauma for a kid, is missing the bus, because it overwhelmed their ability to process that situation. And so they felt paralyzed and flooded and all these feelings, and they weren't able to figure out how to like kind of move forward. So with that, like, let's talk about why it's important for parents to be aware of, we'll say childhood trauma, but just traumas that happen in childhood. Why do you think being a trauma-informed parent is an important part of parenting?
Yeah, well, because, the research shows that some crazy number, I think it's 70% of children will experience trauma by their 18th birthday. And
Whoa.
yeah, I may be off on that a tiny bit, but it's
Yeah.
around 70%. And so because of that, we need to be aware of what our children are experiencing. Not only that, but the early years of life are the most critical for brain development. And so if we are not aware of trauma that our child has gone through, then we aren't helping them process their experience and heal from it. And we also could be re-traumatizing them by our own behavior, because oftentimes these trauma responses in children come out as big emotions and disobedience and frustrating behaviors that parents can get really frustrated with and punish the child for. And when you punish a child for their trauma responses, that becomes a re-traumatization, because the trauma responses are involuntary. They're in sort of an autonomic reaction to something that is stimulating them in the environment and potentially reminding them of a traumatic experience. And so when you punish someone for something they can't control or have no control over, we end up doing more harm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's complicated. So we may see behaviors that they're exhibiting that look like something different. And so if we're aware that they're trauma, then we would have a different lens that we're looking through. But if we view it as, like you said, disobedience or difficult behaviors or just big feelings, like then we might have a different response to that.
Right.
So a lot of times, like we're talking about, kids may not have words for the trauma that they've experienced. So, what do parents need to be looking out for in terms of behavior? Or sometimes it is words that they say, but it may not be talking about the trauma. But, like, what do we need to be looking for to help identify that our kid may have been through something that they are perceiving as trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of ways that trauma manifests in children, and there's no one size fits all description.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, it can be very nuanced and complex, as you mentioned. But some of the main symptoms that we see are, difficulties in functioning in everyday life. So if you have a child who there's just some really has a really difficult time just getting through sort of some of the normal everyday activities, that can be one sign that there has been some sort of trauma. But beyond that, and that's just like a general look, right? But beyond that, there could be disruptions in sleep. So you might have a child who has a lot of difficulty sleeping or is waking up all night long. And again, age matters here, because young children, that's very common in babies and
Sure,
toddlers, right?
sure.
But sleep can be disruptive. There may be night terrors or frequent nightmares is another symptom. Um, Again, some of that could be age related, but you want to look at the whole picture and put it all
Hmm.
together. There's not just one symptom of
Hmm.
trauma, but you want to see like sort of a spectrum of symptoms there. It could be complaining of stomach aches and headaches and bodily pain. Children often don't have the words, like you said, to say, hey, something really awful happened and I'm having trouble coping with it. So
Hmm.
they say, my stomach hurts, or
Hmm.
they say, my head hurts. Now, of course, you always want to have those things checked by a pediatrician first. But if there doesn't seem to be underlying causes for frequent complaints of stomach pain and or head pain or body pain, then there could be that could be their way of saying, I'm hurting.
Hmm.
Something has hurt me. And so that can be tricky for parents, right? Because it's like, oh, wait, do they have is this what's going on here? And it's not just like a one-time thing. This is
Sure.
something that is happening over time.
Hmm.
Um, Another symptom can be, the behaviors, right? So a child who really just is either on one end of the spectrum or other. So is either really shut down and withdrawn and doesn't want to talk and doesn't want to engage and is kind of separating themselves from relationships and pushing people away. Or on the other hand, like a child who has a lot of big behaviors, needs a lot of attention, wants a lot of interaction, and even if it's negative attention, like needs someone, kind of on them all the time. Those are the extreme ends. And so when you see either one of those, it can be symptoms of trauma. Some other things look a lot like some other common diagnoses. So, for example, symptoms of ADHD and autism, they overlap with symptoms of trauma, and it can be really difficult to sort of discern which diagnoses is happening because they're all so similar. And so one of the things with ADHD and trauma is that difficulty paying attention and focusing. That could be a trauma response because their nervous system is so activated that they're always either searching for threats in their environment, or they are just so preoccupied with like worries and thoughts about what happened that they're having trouble focusing and paying attention. So, it's a gray area to get into, but I always feel that we should be assessing like all three of those things and trying to discern what it is. And if you treat the trauma and you get support and help for the trauma, then you see what's left over. And if there's still symptoms of ADHD or autism left over, then, maybe there is really, a genetic component to this, or differences in the brain and things. But oftentimes we're misdiagnosing children who really are struggling with trauma and PTSD.
Yeah. I mean, it is complex, right? So as a parent, I think it's hard to know, like now, there's questions of like, how do you know if your kid's been through a trauma, right? So maybe they've had a dramatic shift in their behavior, right? They were sleeping through the night, but all of a sudden they're not, and they're constantly complaining of stomach aches and headaches, and they're very disruptive to the family system, and they're not like themselves, not just for one day, but for weeks. And so you're like, what is going on? How do we know if our kids have experienced trauma? So if we're saying 70% of kids by their 18th birthday or about that have experienced trauma, I mean, it's likely that our kids are going to have some type of a traumatic event. And sometimes we know it's like, oh my gosh, we were in a car accident. That was really scary. And this, like being aware of that, like holding space for that conversation to see how they're processing that. Yeah. But it might be something a little bit more subtle too, because it might be nuanced, like missing the bus, right? Yeah. Where it's like, as an adult, we're like, hey, we got to school on time. We're good, right? Like this was fine. But for them, it wasn't. So like, how do we know? What are the things that we should be maybe talking to our kids about, or thinking about, or supporting our kids?
Yeah, I think sometimes we might not know exactly what it is, but we're seeing the behaviors and we're seeing the trauma responses. So it's better to just assume that something did kind of happen, and give them support for what they're going through, and kind of give them that, treat them as though they had some sort of traumatizing event. If you're seeing the symptoms, if you're really having trouble in everyday life, like, for example, my daughter found out about school shootings in kindergarten because somebody in her class had heard about it from an older brother and told her that this happened at her school. And she was very distraught and very upset, and we couldn't figure out why. And she was having all the symptoms of trauma. And I was like, what is going on? But I didn't know. Wasn't telling me.
Yeah.
And it took weeks, but I knew that something had happened. So, we kind of have to if we see the behaviors, and so we have to learn about what the symptoms are. And then if we see them, sort of assume that something did happen. Maybe it's not a huge event, but maybe it's, bullying at school, or maybe it's a loss. So many children experience so many types of ambiguous loss. So maybe it's like a move from home to a new town can trigger some trauma responses, or maybe it's the birth of a new child. There's sometimes things that we think are happy changes that for the child are not so happy, or not they're just not able to cope with it because of their makeup, their innate personality, their sensitivities. So, and then sensory challenges or sensory differences is another area that we see trauma symptoms popping up in. So children who are avoidant or seeking different sensory experiences. So children that are, avoiding loud noises, maybe there was something that was traumatic for them that happened that was involved a very loud noise. And so they can't tolerate, loud noises, or maybe it's bright lights, or maybe it's a song that comes on the radio that reminds them of something. And then all of a sudden their behavior flies off the handle, or maybe it's a smell. Maybe they're very sensitive to smells. So there's all different ways that it manifests, but the sensory system is often where trauma gets stuck. And so when you see children either seeking certain behaviors or seeking certain sensory input or stimuli, or avoiding certain stimuli in a way that is, outside the typical experience, then you might be having a child who's dealing with some trauma. So it's better just to kind of assume, because trauma-informed parenting is it's just good parenting, right? Or good enough parenting. It's not, there's nothing, you can't harm a child with trauma-informed parenting. It's just being very aware and very respectful and very sensitive to the needs of the child, and being empathetic and being non-judgmental. And, it's really, we call it trauma-informed parenting, but every child can benefit from that style of parenting. So why not just take on some of the practices anyway?
Yeah.
Behavior. Yeah.
That's great. I'm glad you said that, because I was thinking to myself, like, the question that I'm sure parents are going to have is like, okay, so now I'm treating my child specially, right? Because I'm like, there's probably something that happened. Like, what damage am I doing to my kid by shifting to this type of parenting? But the reality is that, being a parent who is curious, right, about what their kid is going through, is respectful of their emotions, even if we don't understand, and giving them space to feel the feelings. I mean, that we like that as grown-ups, right? When something happens and somebody is like, what, are you okay? What happened? How are you? Right? Like, something's different. We like that. But as parents, sometimes I think we find ourselves in more of an authoritarian role of like, you are going to do this, because we do have objectives that are needing to be completed, right? Like, we have pressures on us to get our kids to school and to, have them sit down and eat dinner because we feel obligated to have them fed, which is good, right? But like, those things can make it so that we're less curious and less understanding about their needs. And even if it's like a picky eater, sometimes that can be like so frustrating for parents. So I think talking about this way is good for all kids. And I agree that being conscious of that, although hard and probably not how we were raised, I think a lot of the parents who are parenting now were not raised in a way where their parents had an awareness of this, right? Because I mean, it's not that it's new. I think there have always been parents who have been more like this, just the way they were. But it is definitely newer to the scene of parenting styles, right? But I like this idea. So what do we do if we identify that our kid has had a trauma? So like, maybe they do say to us, we get curious about it and we're like, hey, like, I've noticed these changes in you, and they tell us something that reveals that there has been a trauma. How can we support that kid?
Yeah. Well, number one, believe them. Sometimes parents, and look, we're all guilty of making mistakes. And even I sometimes like don't believe things that my kid says, and, but we have to validate and believe what they say, is probably the first step, and trust that our kids will, tell us the truth. And
can I pause you for just a second?
Yeah.
What would that sound like? Like, so if your kid comes to you and says, their best friend is bullying them, and you're thinking like your first reaction is like to dismiss or like, no, that didn't happen, or I'm sure that wasn't really how it was. Like, how can we have a supportive response to that? Like, what might that sound like?
Yeah, I think it's reflecting back to them what they said. And as a therapist, you'll be familiar with that technique, but being
Yeah.
like, it sounds like your friend did something to hurt you,
Mhm.
or there's something that your friend is doing that's upsetting you.
Yeah.
And then they'll reveal more. They'll say, yeah, and this happened and that happened and that happened. And it's like, huh, that does sound hurtful.
Yeah.
That does sound like, even that would be hurtful if it happened to me too.
Mhm.
Kind of like showing them that they're not alone in that experience. And just being very non-judgmental and
Mhm.
not try to dismiss. Because I think as parents, and I'm guilty of this as well, that it's so hard to see our kids in pain. It's so painful to think that our kids are hurting,
Mhm.
that it's almost easier to dismiss it or invalidate it and be like, oh, they're just overreacting. They're
Mhm.
just being too sensitive or whatever. They're fine. They're fine. Because it brings up so much in us. It
Yeah.
brings up all of our old stuff that nobody helped us through.
Mhm.
Right. And so when we have old pain, we shun it in our children and we say, oh, you're fine. You're fine. Oh, you'll get over it. It's no big deal. And that is because we have our own pain we haven't addressed. And so maybe they're coming to you with, a bullying situation and you were bullied as a kid and you never had anyone be compassionate with you and you never had anyone to process that experience with. And it really hurt you. And so now when you see it in your child, your first reaction is going to be to shut it down because not because you don't care, it's almost because you care so much that
Mhm.
you might have that reaction. So I don't want anyone to feel bad about having had that reaction in the past. I only know how to have this new reaction because of my training as a therapist, and most people don't have that. So, um, I think just reflecting and saying, yeah, it sounds like someone at school really hurt your feelings.
Mhm.
And then they'll share more and then following up with like, yeah, that it sounds, like just you look really upset about that. You seem angry, you seem sad about that. I can understand why that might have hurt your feelings.
Yeah, and I think that was really good. I mean, because I think sometimes as parents, they like, let's say the bullying thing is the dynamic, and you may not want to name it that yet, and you don't actually have to, but you can just
Yeah.
say that was really upsetting to you. Like, or I can tell that they really hurt your feelings. Like, can you tell me about that? Like, what happened? I'm curious about what happened to you today. That was really upsetting. And in that part, then you're opening the door that it doesn't have to be named whatever they said
Right.
if they have a reconsideration of that title, right? And I think bullying is such a controversial name for things because it gets complex. But I mean, mean behavior definitely happens in kids for sure, and on purpose sometimes, right? So it's like this idea that they can name it something, and we may be pausing on the titling of what happened to get curious about the situation without dismissing their experience. And that you can do both of like be curious and also affirming to that was their real experience. Okay, so once we've like believed them, which I think is definitely a first, is probably one of the most important steps, is just like that part in itself. What my experience has been is that that part can be healing, right? Just to have somebody who believes you,
Yeah.
even if there's nothing next that happens, just like for somebody who just believes that that happened to you and like listen to you, that can in itself. But obviously there's more things that we can do, but I think that part for me is sometimes the most transformative of like when I hear people talk about their traumas that they
Mhm.
had in childhood, and like what I hear the theme is when people made it through successfully. I mean, sometimes it's going to therapy, sometimes it's um a bigger support system of more people coming around, but just like somebody believing them
Mhm.
is so important. So, okay. So once we've believed our child that this experience, whatever it is, has been really hard for them, and really did happen, what else can we do to support our kids?
Yeah. So, I think it looks like continuing that conversation, making sure you're keeping open lines of communication. If there's some type of, if it's disrupting like their everyday life and you really need extra support, of course, finding a trauma-informed therapist is always recommended, but it's not always easy to find, right? And it looks like really focusing on helping the child feel safe in their body again. Because what trauma does is it removes our sense of safety and trust in ourselves, in the world, and the people around us. And so we have to help them rebuild that sense of trust and safety again. And that happens in relationships. So your relationship and the research, there's research from Harvard University that shows that just one consistent, loving, compassionate, caring adult in a child's life can mitigate a good portion of any traumatic experience. So your relationship with your child is everything, and our connections are what help us heal. And so if you can help them feel safe and be that trustworthy person, be that person that keeps your word, focus on safety and trust instead of academics at that moment, or, social gatherings, kind of reprioritize things to focusing on how do I help my child feel safe again? What can I do that will rebuild their trust in others and in themselves and in the world? And that's not always a quick process, right? There's no quick fix for these things. It is a longer term process when it comes to trauma, but definitely getting the support that they need through a trauma-informed therapist, as well as learning yourself all about it. Like you kind of have to become a little researcher and get out there and learn and listen to podcasts, or a wonderful source of information on how to help children heal from trauma. But yeah, I mean, at the crux of it, it's our trust that is broken when we experience trauma. So wrapping support and love around them and helping them to trust again. And listen, it might not be bubble wrapping them, right? That doesn't mean you bubble wrap them and avoid everything, because avoidance just creates more anxiety a lot of times. And sometimes it's valid. You might need to avoid certain triggers or activations in their nervous system at first. But really the goal to heal from trauma is to expose yourself to it again in like small doses, not terrible things like obviously a car accident or things like that, but a child who's anxious after a trauma, we tend to want to like bubble wrap them and not let anything ever happen to them again. And we're not helping them in that way, responding in that way. We really need to like help them reacclimate and try things again and learn that there can be positive things in the world. And so those experiences are called corrective emotional experiences. And they typically happen in relationships, but it's when a child expects one reaction, they expect something terrible, and then they get the opposite reaction from the adult or the person they think is going to harm them. They get the opposite reaction. They get the positive. They get the thing they didn't expect. And that can help to correct the emotional injury that had taken place, and kind of prove to the child that, oh, okay, just because this one thing happened or this one person was harmful to me doesn't mean that everybody is harmful. Doesn't mean that every situation is going to turn out this way. So we do have to, it's a delicate balance, but it doesn't mean that we hide them from the world and never, they have to get out there and learn that there are safe people, that there are, things that go right.
Yes. Well, and even if this to me, like I had a lot of thoughts as you were saying that, like one of the things is like the importance of teachers, right, in our kids' lives too, of like they spend a lot of time with our kids and they have such a powerful opportunity to be a safe, trusted adult. Um, which is also why when trauma happens at school, it's such a big thing. But I think, it's that's a cool opportunity that educators have to have such a positive impact on our children. But then I was also thinking, like, so you're saying like we're exposing them. This is also kind of the gold standard for phobias is like exposing ourselves to the thing that scares us. That doesn't mean if our kid was sexually abused that we are going to expose them to
No.
that perpetrator again.
No.
That is obviously not a safe person. They cannot be trusted, right? Like that
Right,
you
right,
have to
right.
protect your person. And I know you weren't saying that, but just to clarify,
No, I'm glad you said
right.
that. Yeah,
Yes.
even as I was saying it, I was like, oh, it didn't come out right.
No,
But
your message
yeah,
is right, I think, but it's like those very extenuating circumstances that we are not going to expose our kids to. But it's like if it was let's say it was sexual abuse and it was a male that was the perpetrator, it's believing that there are safe males because there are safe males, right? So it's or our kid was in a car accident and it's like they don't want to get in the car. Our goal is going to be to work back to being able to be in the car because depending on where you live, I mean, some people can take a bus or a train or something like that, but other people do not have an option. And the car is the only mode of transportation to get their kid to school or wherever. And so we do have to kind of push those boundaries. But our brain, when trauma happens or any anxiety, right? Trauma creates anxiety, fear of the unknown or the certain that everybody is going to do that same behavior. And then we create kind of rules for our brain to operate around to keep us safe. And sometimes those rules are really only applicable to that one particular situation. But because of how our brain works, and its perceived efficiency, I think, is that it doesn't go back to really look at trauma. So it just applies the rule to all the things. And so then we're like, okay, so like, when we were cave people, like down this road is a tiger, right? And so it's like, we're not going to go down that road. But does the tiger always live down this road?
right.
Right? Not always, right? And so if it's something where it's like there are things that do shift, there are people who are tricky and we should avoid those people or people that have done something that is not appropriate in an adult child relationship. Like that's a different thing. Let's let that story be told because let's keep ourselves safe from that.
Yeah.
But if it's about a generalized experience that we're
Right.
generalizing to everybody or everything like that, black cars are going to get in accidents. Well, that's not really true, right? Like there's plenty of black cars on the road that never get in a car accident,
Yes.
but our kids can extrapolate, apply this situation to everything. And that's what creates more fear. So we do have to kind of push against that part because then you are essentially bubble wrapping yourself, right? You're avoiding all the situations. And then we can even amplify it to things that have nothing to do with that particular experience. But it's like anything that feels like that is obviously bad. And it's like new experiences are scary sometimes. And so if we have that, our amygdala gets turned on, our alarm system in our brain gets turned on about something, then it's going to start applying it to other things too. And then that can really negatively impact anybody, but especially our kids.
Right.
So after we've listened to our kids, we've like validated what they're experiencing, we are supporting them to re-experience things that are safe. What other things can we do as a parent to just like support our kids who have experienced something traumatic?
Yeah. So I mentioned the sensory stuff earlier. And so there's a lot of things we can do with our bodies that helps us manage our anxiety and helps us manage, any of the trauma responses that are kind of coming up. And so for some children, it's really soothing to be really active with their bodies and be on a trampoline or be, jumping around. And so I like to kind of go down the route of occupational therapists when I when I help families and children because they have so many great tools for managing the emotions really through the body. And so looking at how can we support this child's nervous system to feel soothed and at ease. And maybe that's a lot of movement for that child, because guess what? One of the one of the trauma responses is flight, right? And so moving around can feel really safe for a child who's experiencing a trauma response. And so again, that's one of those unconscious, like just automatic responses is the fight, flight, freeze, and now there's a couple other they're adding on like fawn, and I think there's another one. But the child who's moving all the time and can't sit still, he might be in a flight response. So giving him opportunities to run, giving him opportunities to jump on the trampoline or to move around, that's how we can support his nervous system.
Sure.
On the other spectrum, it might be a child who's avoiding certain sensory things. So, maybe loud noises, are really activating for them, and they're having trouble in the classroom because there's so much noise. And so maybe there's ways that we can help them find time for quiet, and help them support their nervous system by, when things are really loud, the noise canceling headphones occasionally, and not all the time, but because that's not reality, right? We can't just wear headphones throughout life and not hear anything. But for extreme loud noises, maybe that is something that supports the child's nervous system. So it's paying attention. You have to almost be a detective as a parent, right? We have so many roles. And I want to circle back to what we were saying about that wanting to bubble wrap, and that initial reaction to the child experiencing a trauma and just wanting to protect them from everything and everybody. I totally get that. That's how I would feel too if it were my child. I kind of feel that way anyway, just on a regular day. So when something happens to your child, you also are experiencing a trauma because that's your child. And so seeing your child be in pain or have been harmed can be traumatic for yourself. And so that instinct to want to protect or avoid things, which avoiding things is another type of trauma response, is natural. But I think like with the help of a therapist, and we don't want to push anybody too far, too fast right away, but like with the help of a trauma-informed therapist or with your own knowledge and reading and researching about how to push those boundaries. And I think it can be done over time. Like it's not something we would want to like force anybody into before they were ready, but taking small bite-sized, very small incremental steps towards the black car. Maybe at first you just look at pictures of a black car, maybe that's the first step. Or maybe you just think about a black car, and then you look at pictures. Then, after that, you do that for a while, then you actually see the car, from across the parking lot or something. Like my point is that it has to be done very slowly and titrated, to what the child can handle. So, and again, that should all be done with like the help of a therapist, not something you should take on yourself.
Yeah.
But so I just wanted to circle back to that before I forgot. But yeah, I think trying to find ways to soothe and calm their nervous system. Some of that will be with physical movements or changes in the environment, but some of that is going to be from us, is the co-regulation, which is that ability to, I kind of think of nervous systems as able to like link up, like you're almost like linking up and you're kind of in like a loop together, and you kind of literally link up to each other's nervous system. And if we can find a way to be settled in our own nervous systems, like taking care of our own mental health needs and finding the support that we need by going to therapy or by exercising or eating healthy, all of those things that are supportive to our mental health, then when we spend time with our children, they're going to naturally link into our nervous system, and we're going to help them learn how to regulate their emotions when big feelings come up. And that doesn't mean being calm all the time. Like that's unrealistic, right? In fact, in order for co-regulation to truly happen, you have to get dysregulated a bit. You have to get upset because if you're not registering some kind of upset, you're not truly mirroring the child's behavior, not truly linking up with their nervous system. So yes, you are going to get upset like at first, but the magic happens in your ability to kind of pull yourself down
Mhm.
from that heightened state and pull yourself back into a baseline so that you can help pull the child back down into baseline um,
Mhm.
of nervous system activation. And I know this might sound very kind of sciencey, but um,
Yeah.
but
No, it's great. I mean, it's fantastic. I mean, co-regulation is so important as a parent. Like I struggle with this of like sometimes there are things that happen and I am like upset about this,
yeah,
right? So it is hard, but it's like when I recognize like there are things that I say internally to myself or I think about. Becky Bailey talks about being the potted plant and like to just be there. You're not solving all the problems. Like, you're just there as like a stability point. Like
Mhm.
that helps me. Like sometimes I'm like, this like isn't my hill to die on, right? Like I'm like, whatever the thing was to I needed to happen for my kids, right? Like, is this really worth that thing? Sometimes, like, right, like that I'm going to have my point be the right one. Sometimes I'm wrong. Sometimes I am wrong. Totally. And I say to my kids, like, I'm just one mommy or I'm still learning, right? Like these
Yeah.
things where it is opening us to this idea that we don't have to be perfect. And I think that helps, right? But yes, that we have to have emotions. We're going to have emotions. Like that is part of being human. But I do think co-regulation, I love, there's lots of little pictures that you see of people trying to model what co-regulation looks like, where it's like, the boat on the really rough sea, and then it meets the calm boat, and then it's like both of the boats are like kind of like it's not calm. Yeah, it's a little rocky, but they're together, right? Or the kid who is like the flame, and then the parents holding the flame, and then the flame turns back into their child. Like I love all of those imageries because it helps us to understand like it is gonna be really hard. It is hard to co-regulate, but it actually helps to shift the emotional dysregulation that's happening much faster. Because sometimes we just want to be like, stop it. Like, stop doing that, right? Like, and sometimes it's like, hey, could we take a break from that? And that works, right? Stop it has never worked in my world, but I I think, like that sometimes works, but oftentimes that's not the best strategy for my children is
Yeah.
just like me staying calm and being like, this is really frustrating. Like I can have emotional conversations without displaying the emotion too of like, I'm getting really upset. Like this is bothering me. Without screaming and throwing things or whatever, right? Like I can express the emotion. But that co-regulation is so important. And you're talking about how parents can kind of support themselves. And I love this conversation because I do think being a parent is really probably one of the most challenging jobs. Also the most rewarding in my opinion, but also very challenging because we're not really prepared for this. Like people are always like, "Hey, when are you going to have kids?" And then, it's like and then you do and then you're like, "Oh my gosh, I was not prepared for all of these things." And I think in every stage of my kids' lives or even being pregnant, I'm like, I was not prepared for all of these parts of the things that happen and it's okay, but it's like we don't come into this all knowing, and that even me and even you, right, as people who are experts in children, right, like we're not always prepared. We may know the skills, but we may not always use them.
Exactly. Oh, I'm so guilty of that. It is the most challenging job. And for a long time, I'm really hard on myself as a parent. I think because I'm supposed to know so much and because I'm a child therapist and things like that, that I'm really hard on myself. And, what helped me was my therapist is like double board certified psychiatrist and like children and adults. He's also an MD. He's also a psychotherapist. Like he has all these things, all these degrees from like the best schools in the world and all this stuff. And he sat me down in the first session when I came in, just a blubbering mess about, whatever parenting stuff. And he was like, he talked about his credentials and stuff. And then he's like, but you know what's harder than all that? Being a parent.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, being a parent is still harder, is still harder, and his kids are grown, than all those degrees and being a doctor and being a psychiatrist and being a therapist. Like nothing compares to the challenge of parenting. And that really helped me feel less hard on myself. Because we're all going to make mistakes. And if we didn't mess up with our kids, what would we really be teaching them?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you don't mess up, they almost need us to mess up to a degree. I mean, not, hopefully not too bad, but,
Sure.
they
Yeah.
need to see that like people make mistakes and then they recover from those mistakes. Because if they don't, like they learn more from our behavior than our words. And so if we don't ever mess up, what are we teaching our kids? That they can't make a mistake? That when they mess up, that their whole world should fall apart? We have to show them that we can make mistakes and we can recover from them. It's that whole concept of, rupture and repair.
Yeah.
Where we can go back. And I say, when I mess up, I go back to my child and I say, it may not be, right in the moment, but, an hour or two later, hey, I do not like how that went. I was not my best self in that situation. And I'm sorry that I lost my temper.
Yeah.
And it's not going to fix everything, but at least a step in the right direction to show them and model to them, like you can make mistakes and you can admit them and you can still be okay, even though you messed up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's huge in terms of parenting. Of what we can do for ourselves is just giving ourselves some grace, right? Of like, we are going to have times where we make mistakes or hurt our kids unintentionally or say something in a way that we didn't actually mean to say it, but we can repair. That's good. What other ways do you think parents, especially who have had a kid who's had trauma, can support themselves in this process?
Support for the parent, you mean?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, there's so many different things, but I think being aware, being self-awareness, anytime you can build some self-awareness is key. And the more you are aware of yourself and your own needs and your own trauma, the better parent you're going to be, because these unconscious sort of triggers or activations, I like to call them, are going to happen to all of us. And knowing what sets us off and being able to say, this isn't because of my child's behavior, this is touching something in me, and I need to work on healing that inner part of me that's still hurting. And we can usually recognize these things by anything that makes us have really strong reaction to our child's behavior, because children are just being children most of the time. They're not doing anything on purpose. They're just reacting to their environment, their nervous system, their developmental stage, whatever it might be. But we take things so personally because of our own unhealed parts. And so I think journaling can be really helpful to like journal about, any old pains that you might have left over from childhood. If you're recognizing like the same thing sets you off, you're noticing patterns. Like this always upsets me. This is like my sticking point. Like this is the one thing my kid does it and I'm just so angry about it. You want to dig deeper there and build some self-awareness around what is it that's really hurting? What is it that's making you so angry about that behavior? Is it when they don't listen to you? Maybe someone didn't listen to you when you were a child, that someone needed to hear what you had to say, and kind of being introspective into your old stuff. And the reason that helps so much is because it prevents that re-traumatization, that punishing the behavior, when you can get some distance from it and say, okay, this isn't so much about what my kid is doing. It's more about something that is unresolved in me. Then we're less likely to have a big explosion and have a, uh, you know, throw our own tantrum.
Mhm.
And I also think part of it is, and I mean, this might be controversial, but I think part of it is like, we expect so much from kids. Like, we expect them to be able to handle things that are outside of their developmental capabilities often.
Mhm.
Because children are so smart and can do things that are amaze us, and we're like, oh my gosh, you can do that, or she can do this. Like, of course she should be able then to manage her emotions.
Yeah.
But children are not able to manage their emotions on their own until, I don't know, I don't think any of us are actually, like even adults have meltdowns and we can't manage
Yes.
our own emotions. So why do we think that children should be able to,
Mhm.
sit still in classroom all day? They can you sit still all day at work? It's like
Yeah.
we expect some certain things from children that are unrealistic, unfortunately. So I think sort of giving them more space, being curious, being empathetic, and trying not to judge, and working on ourselves and our own stuff, because we all have it, and
Yeah.
there's nothing wrong with anybody for having it.
Yep.
It's typically not anyone's fault.
Mhm.
It's just real life is sometimes painful.
Yeah.
Um, so
That's great. I mean, this has all been such a fantastic conversation. I so appreciate you being here, Beth, and talking to us about trauma, because I think it's such a good topic to talk about. And there's so much to learn here about how trauma impacts all of us, but especially our kids. So
yeah.
thank you.
Yes. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thanks again for your time today, Beth. That was all really good information. I don't know about you, but there was so many things that I want to take away from this conversation with Beth about how trauma impacts our kids. And I'll just focus on a few that I'm taking away and I think you could think about as well. The first is believing our kids and what they're saying, and that their words and their experience is their experience. So we don't necessarily have to see the story the same way, but we can validate what they're experiencing. And that is an important part. And the second one is to be the person that our kids can trust and count on. We can't count on anybody else to be the person to show up for our kids. And the research is showing that one adult that is consistent and trustworthy and believes that kid and supports that kid is life changing. So we have to be that person to show up and be that for our kids. With that, I will say thank you so much for your time today. Thanks for coming to grow your parenting toolbox and to see how childhood trauma can impact our kids and their behaviors and their friends in our environment. And I would love it if you would share our show with people that you care about, and follow us on Facebook and YouTube, Instagram. Don't forget to rate and subscribe to our show. And also, if there's a topic that you would love for us to cover, please email us to accidentalexperts@gmail.com. Have a fantastic day. Some words from our legal team.
The information presented in this podcast is not intended or implied to be a substitute for appropriate professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All content, including text, graphics, images, and information contained on or available through this podcast, is for general information purposes only. This podcast makes no representations and assumes no responsibility for the accuracy or information on or available through this podcast, and such information is subject to change without notice. You are encouraged to confirm any information obtained through this program with other sources and review all information regarding any condition or treatment with the appropriate professionals.
What we're saying is, yes, I am a real therapist, but I'm not your therapist.